For close to 50 years, one stretch of the Sahara stayed quiet. A pale antelope had once crossed it in herds of many thousands. People named it the scimitar-horned oryx, after its long curved horns. Those horns swept back over its shoulders like two thin blades. Grown males and females both carried them, long and finely ringed. Each curved horn could grow to about a meter in length. Its coat shone white, with a neck and chest of reddish brown. It could last for weeks in that heat without drinking open water. It drew moisture straight from the desert plants it grazed after dark. For thousands of years it owned the dry grasslands of North Africa. Then the herds thinned, the tracks faded, and the ground went silent. By the year 2000, none of them remained alive in the wild. The species had not died out fully, and that fact matters here. Small groups still lived in zoos and fenced parks around the world, but the open desert that made them held none of them at all. A whole animal had been erased from the place that shaped it. For a generation, no calf was born free under that hard sky. Then, after all those empty years, a single herd came home. What happened after their return surprised even the people who planned it. This is the story of how one herd woke a silent desert. If accounts of lost animals finding their way home hold you, stay here. Every week this channel follows real efforts to save species from the edge. A quick tap on the subscribe button helps these stories reach more people. The beginning of all this sits in the years of the Great Vanishing. The oryx did not fall all at once, but slowly, across decades. For most of history it thrived where almost nothing else could live. Its old range ran clear across North Africa, from coast to coast. Herds crossed the dry belt below the Sahara from the Atlantic eastward. That belt of thorn and grass is the land people call the Sahel. Herds of several thousand once gathered on the edge of the desert. Traders and explorers once described plains that seemed white with moving oryx. Early travelers wrote of white antelope moving in long, shining lines. The animal was built for a world of sand, wind, and heat. Its wide hooves spread its weight across soft ground and loose dunes. Its pale coat threw back the sun and kept its body cool. The dark skin beneath that coat guarded it from burns in the glare. To beat the heat, its body could hold on to water with real skill. It let its temperature climb through the day and cooled off at night. By grazing after dark, it took in plants that were damp with dew. This let whole herds live far from any river or standing pool. It could smell fresh grass growing after rain from many miles away. When rain fell somewhere far off, the oryx seemed to sense it. Whole herds would set out across dry country toward that distant green. For centuries, the people of the Sahel lived beside these great herds. The oryx fed them, and its horns filled their oldest desert stories. Seen from the side, its two long horns can blur into one. That trick of the eye may sit behind the old unicorn legend. Ancient Egyptians painted animals like the oryx on their tomb walls. The animal lived in human memory long before it began to vanish. Trouble came with rifles, engines, and a shifting climate altogether. In the early 20th century, firearms spread across North Africa fast. The spread of the rifle changed the desert faster than anything before. Hunters on horseback had rarely threatened the swift, long-running herds. Hunters in fast vehicles carrying rifles were a different matter entirely. An oryx could outrun a horse, yet no oryx could outrun a truck. Motor cars chased the herds across open ground until the animals dropped. A hunting party in trucks could empty a valley in a single day. There were no limits, no seasons, and no one counting the dead. Meat, hides, and horns were taken faster than the herds could replace. The horns that had made the oryx famous also made it a target. Trophy hunters prized the long curved horns above almost all others. The killing grew heaviest during years of war and unrest in the region. Soldiers and travelers shot oryx for food and for sport alike. The animal that had survived the desert could not survive the engine. Then the rains themselves began to fail across the southern Sahara. Long droughts struck the Sahel through the 1960s and 70s. Those droughts were among the worst the Sahel had ever known. They killed crops and livestock and many people across several nations. The grasses that the oryx depended on dried and did not return. Wells and seasonal pools that herds had used for ages went dry. Families and their herds pushed into any land that still held grass. Cattle and goats spread into the last of the good grazing. The wild oryx had to share its last refuge with hungry livestock. The wild oryx were pushed into smaller and harsher patches of desert. Fences and new roads cut across paths the herds had always used. Each pressure alone might have been survivable for such a tough animal. Together, across a few short decades, they proved too much to bear. The great herds broke into small bands, and the bands broke apart. By the 1970s, the vast herds had shrunk to scattered groups. In Chad, once a stronghold, sightings grew rare, and then rarer still. Field workers who had counted thousands now struggled to find a dozen. The last strong population held on in the grasslands of central Chad. Even there, the animals were slipping away year after painful year. Neighboring Niger lost its wild oryx around that same grim stretch of time. By the late 1980s, only a handful were left anywhere wild. Search teams crossed enormous ground and came back with empty notebooks. By the late 1990s, the last wild oryx had simply gone. No one could point to a single free herd anywhere on the continent. In the year 2000, a hard line was finally drawn on paper. The International Union for Conservation of Nature made the loss official. It listed the scimitar-horned oryx as extinct in the wild. Those 5 words meant no wild herd survived anywhere on the whole earth. The animal that had ruled the desert now lived only behind fences. For most vanished animals, that ruling would have been the final word. Yet the story did not end there. Out in that empty desert, the oryx held one strange advantage over most animals lost from the wild. Long before the wild herds fell, some had been shipped abroad. Zoos and private parks had kept scimitar-horned oryx for many years. Animals had gone to Europe, to America, and to the Gulf states. A leader in Chad had once sent oryx abroad as living gifts. Those scattered captive animals were now the entire future of the species. By then, over 220 parks and zoos held oryx. Kept apart, each small group carried only a slice of the whole. Bred together with care, they might hold enough variety to survive. Keepers and scientists began to track every animal like a family tree. They wrote down which oryx bred with which, and which calves lived. This record, kept for years, is what conservationists call a stud book. Their combined records became the living memory of an entire species. The aim was to keep the captive herds healthy and well mixed. For years, this felt like tending a museum of living creatures. The animals were safe in their pens, far from their home ground. This kind of return had one hopeful example behind it already. In Mongolia, the wild horse called Przalski's horse had come back too. It had also been declared extinct in the wild, then brought back. So the oryx team was not working entirely without a map. The Arabian oryx had returned to Oman's desert back in the 80s. That success gave the scimitar oryx team a plan they could trust. Tunisia and Morocco had raised fenced oryx herds in earlier decades. Those herds lived behind wire, not loose across open desert. Chad's project aimed higher, at oryx running truly wild and unfenced. Still, the plan asked a hard question with no easy answer at first. No one knew if animals raised behind fences could turn wild again. The only way to learn the answer was to try it. One place carried the dream of a true return further than any other. That place was Abu Dhabi, on the edge of the Arabian desert. The founder of the United Arab Emirates loved the native desert animals. That founder was Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi. He had watched the Arabian oryx nearly vanish from his own homeland. He had helped bring that cousin species back from the very brink. That earlier rescue proved a wild antelope could return after being lost. After his death, his family carried that same aim forward with him. The Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi built a very large oryx herd. On protected island and desert sites, their oryx numbers kept climbing. By the 2000s, they held one of the biggest herds anywhere. Conservationists came to call this large group the world herd. It would supply the animals for any serious return to the wild. A herd in Abu Dhabi could not fix the wild on its own. Someone had to choose a place, prepare it, and accept the risk. The species needed a home in its old range, back in Africa. Through the early 2010s, a real plan slowly took shape. The Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi agreed to lead and fund it. The government of Chad agreed to host the returning oryx herds. A group called the Sahara Conservation Fund would run things on the ground. Scientists from the Zoological Society of London joined the effort as well. The Smithsonian and several other zoos lent their long field experience. One particular patch of Chad kept coming up in every discussion. That patch was the Ouadi Rimé and Ouadi Achim Reserve. It sits in central Chad, in the animal's old home range. The reserve itself had first been set aside in 1969. For years it had been a park with almost nothing left to guard. The reserve is huge, covering close to 78,000 square kilometers. That is a protected area roughly the size of the state of Maine. It has no paved roads and almost no permanent buildings inside it. Grasslands, low dunes, and scattered trees stretch to the horizon there. Summer heat there can climb past what most animals could ever bear. Rain comes in a short season and then holds off for months. An oryx must cross great distances to follow that thin green line. The reserve ranks among the largest protected areas in all of Africa. Its sheer size gives the herd room to move like it once did. For the oryx, room to roam is part of staying alive. This was the very ground where Chad's last wild oryx had lived. Herders and their families still moved across the reserve with their livestock. Any plan would only work if those local people truly supported it. In 2012, leaders met in Chad's capital to talk it through. Local herder groups, officials, and outside experts all sat together there. They agreed the reserve should be rebuilt and the oryx brought back. The president of Chad gave the whole plan his open backing. Formal agreements between Chad and Abu Dhabi were then drawn up and signed. Now the hardest practical work could finally begin in earnest. If you are enjoying how this plan comes together, a like really helps. It tells the platform to show this story to other curious viewers. Comment with the name of an animal you would want brought back. We read them, and your ideas often shape the videos made next. Choosing which animals to send was a careful and patient task. The team gathered oryx from the world herd held in Abu Dhabi. Scientists wanted the released herd to hold as much variety as possible. The Royal Zoological Society of Scotland tested the animals for their genes. They studied close to 300 oryx kept at the Abu Dhabi sites. The tests showed how the animals were related to one another. The Smithsonian Zoo team helped study the animals' health and genes. Their work stretched back years before the first oryx ever flew. From this, the team could pick a mix that avoided close inbreeding. A varied founding herd had the best chance of long-term health. A small founding herd can carry hidden weakness in its genes. Careful breeding choices were meant to keep that danger as low as possible. The chosen oryx were moved to holding pens for close daily watching. Each animal was checked for disease before any long trip could begin. Vets checked each animal's health before and after every flight. A single sick animal could have threatened the whole young herd. The plan was to send the oryx in careful, measured groups. No one wanted to risk the whole future on a single flight. The oryx would travel not in one flight, but across several years. Roughly 8 separate shipments would carry oryx from Abu Dhabi to Chad. Spreading the trips out lowered the danger to the founding herd. Building the release site in the reserve was its own enormous job. Crews drove deep into roadless country to raise fenced pre-release pens. Water tanks and feed had to be trucked far into the desert. The pens would let arriving oryx settle before facing open wild land. The team studied old records to learn where oryx once found water. They mapped the grasses and the seasons across the giant reserve. Rangers were hired and trained to guard the animals day and night. They learned to read tracks, fix vehicles, and treat sick animals. They would be the eyes on the herd once the pens opened. Everything had to work in a place with no shops or spare parts. Fuel, tools, and food came in over rough tracks and soft sand. Nothing about the work was quick, and nothing about it was cheap. After years of planning, the first animals were finally ready to travel. On the 14th of March in 2016, the day arrived. 25 scimitar-horned oryx were loaded for the long trip to Chad. They flew from Abu Dhabi across thousands of miles of open sky. When the crates opened, the animals stepped onto Chadian soil once more. It was the first time wild range oryx had stood there in decades. People who had worked years for this moment stood and watched in silence. Some of them wept as the oryx moved into the holding pens. An animal erased from this land had been carried right back to it. The 25 stayed inside fenced pens before any taste of freedom. They spent months there getting used to the home of their ancestors. Inside the pens, they learned the local grasses, the heat, the water. Keepers watched closely to see that each animal fed and stayed healthy. In the pens, staff cut back on human contact bit by bit. The goal was for the oryx to fear people and stay wary. A wild animal that trusts humans does not last long out there. Slowly, the oryx shed the habits of a life behind zoo fences. Day by day, the herd grew leaner, faster, and more alert. They began to act like desert animals once more, watchful and lean. When the team judged them ready, the pen gates were swung open. The oryx walked out of the pens and into the open reserve. For the first time in a lifetime, wild oryx roamed free there. This slow method has a name among biologists: the soft release. Animals eased into freedom tend to stay and settle far better. Fitted collars sent signals so the team could follow each animal. The collars used satellites to mark each oryx on a moving map. Scientists could see how far and how fast the herd spread out. Some oryx wandered far from the release site into fresh grazing. Others stayed close, forming the core of a settled home herd. Some collars dropped off on a timer so the oryx ran free. The teams gathered the fallen collars to read the stored travel logs. The data told the team the animals were living as true nomads. The oryx did what their kind had always done in that country. They moved toward distant rain, grazed by night and gathered by day. Each dry season and each burst of rain tested the young herd. The oryx passed those tests, season after season, on their own. The first wild months were the hardest test the herd would face. Released animals had to find water and food without any human help. They had to learn the reserve's hidden pools and seasonal green patches. Predators and harsh weather took some, as they take any wild herd. The ones that lived grew leaner, warier, and surer of the ground. They still carried the desert's old map somewhere deep inside them. Then, in December of that same year, came the moment that mattered. A female that had been released gave birth in the open desert. The first wild-born oryx calf in decades stood there in the sand. No fence, no pen, and no keeper had brought that calf about. It was born free, in the same land its ancestors had ruled. That single calf proved the returned herd could breed on its own. A born and bred wild oryx was walking the Sahel once again. Rangers protected that first calf as it found its feet in the sand. Its survival through the first dry season was watched with held breath. More flights followed over the next several years, out of Abu Dhabi. Group after group of oryx made the same long trip south. By later counts, the team had moved about 285 animals. Each new group strengthened the young wild herd already on the ground. Calves kept arriving, born to mothers that had themselves been released. More calves followed the first one, born out in the open sand. Soon calves were being born to females that were wild-born themselves. Within a few years, wild births outpaced the animals flown in. That was the sign the team had hoped for above all others. The wild population was growing on its own, birth after steady birth. The desert that had been silent now held families of oryx again. Rangers on patrol began to report herds moving over the old ground. Ground teams kept a running tally of the growing wild herd. Each new count showed more oryx than the one before it. Where surveys had once found nothing, they now counted living animals. Field teams drove long routes to count animals and check their health. They logged births, deaths, and the paths the collared oryx traveled. Every scrap of data helped guide the next release and the next. The reserve became an open-air study of how a species rebuilds itself. Over the years, the collared animals drew a picture of their world. That picture will help protect the herd through the dry years ahead. Year by year, the number of wild oryx in Chad climbed higher. The first target had been 500 oryx living in the wild. Many had feared even that number would take a very long time. The herd reached it faster than the careful planners had dared hope. By 2023, more than 600 oryx lived in the reserve. Over 500 of those calves had been born free in the wild. The world herd in Abu Dhabi had seeded a true wild population. Then came the news the whole long effort had been aiming toward. In December of 2023, the Conservation Union spoke again. It took the scimitar-horned oryx off the extinct in the wild list at last. The species was now listed instead as endangered, a real step upward. That change of status is rare and hard-won in conservation work. Very few animals once gone from the wild have ever come back. Only a few species have ever made this exact return trip. The oryx joined a very short list of true wild comebacks. Its comeback now guides teams working to rescue other lost animals. The oryx had crossed from erased all the way back to endangered. Endangered still means the animal is in danger and needs guarding. It also means, though, that the animal exists and breeds on its own. For a species written off in the year 2000, that is huge. Beyond Chad, several thousand oryx still live in parks around the world. That backup population guards against losing the species all over again. The return of the oryx changed more than one animal's fate. The same reserve is now a shelter for other threatened desert species. The addax, a stocky pale antelope, sits even closer to the edge. Dama gazelles, among the rarest gazelles alive, share that ground too. The slender horned gazelle, another desert ghost, lives in that region as well. The work done for the oryx now helps guard these neighbors too. Rangers and monitoring built for one animal protect the others beside it. A living reserve draws study and funding that empty land never could. The oryx became a kind of flagship for the whole desert around it. Protecting it spread a shield over these fellow desert dwellers. As the wild oryx grazed, they spread seeds and worked the dry soil. Their grazing helped keep the old desert grassland healthy and open. The oryx also gave the people of the region something back. Herders again share the reserve with an animal from their oldest stories. Their grandparents had spoken of the white antelope of the deep desert. Now their grandchildren can watch that same antelope cross the plain. A gap of 2 or 3 generations had been closed in one reserve. Chadian rangers and scientists now lead much of the daily field work. Young people there are training in wildlife tracking and desert science. They knew the land in ways no outside expert ever could. The return grew into a source of real pride across the country. Word of the oryx spread far beyond the borders of Chad. Conservation groups pointed to it as proof that recovery was still possible. Students and scientists studied the release to guide their own future work. It showed that captive herds could still hold a species' true future. It proved a careful plan could turn extinct in the wild around. The story reached people who had never heard of the animal before. There is no promise that the story stays easy from here. The wild oryx still face drought, disease, and the threat of poaching. The herd lives unfenced, open to every danger the desert holds. Monitoring must go on for decades to keep the population safe. One good year does not guarantee that the next one will follow. The people who brought the oryx back know the work is unfinished. They watch the collars, count the calves, and prepare for hard seasons. A recovery like this can still slip backward if it is neglected. Still, what has already happened would have seemed impossible not long ago. The oryx once lived from the Atlantic coast across to the Nile. By the year 2000, that whole span sat empty of oryx. Now in one reserve, a piece of that lost world had returned. An animal declared gone from the wild is raising calves in the sand. Herds move again across ground that stood empty for close to 50 years. The silence that held that desert for a lifetime has been broken. It was broken by one chosen herd and the people who believed. 25 animals stepped off a plane and began rebuilding a whole species. The herd there is still small against the size of the old range. Yet a small wild herd beats no wild herd at all. Every calf born free widens the gap between the oryx and extinction. The satellite collars keep sending their steady signals across the sand. Each signal is a living animal where there were none before. The team hopes the herd will one day fill more of its range. Talk has begun of returning oryx to still more of their old country. The addax may one day follow the same path back from the edge. What worked for the oryx could work for its desert neighbors too. Their story shows that extinction in the wild need not be the end. The desert did not forgive the mistakes that had emptied it. Bringing the oryx home took money, science, and many patient years. It took people in several countries agreeing to share one goal, and it took animals tough enough to pick up their old life. The oryx did not save itself, and it could never have done so. People in Chad, in Abu Dhabi, and beyond chose to bring it home. That choice turned an empty desert back into a living one again. If this story moved you, you can help these efforts in small ways. Share this video so more people learn that such recoveries are real. Subscribe to follow the oryx and other species finding their way back. Tell us in the comments which animals' return you would like to see. Somewhere out in that reserve tonight, a wild oryx calf is sleeping. Its whole kind was gone from the wild, and now it is here. That is what one herd changed in a desert that had gone silent.